welcome friends. In Indian economy, industrial policy, we were discussing industrial policy 1956 and we had moved over to discussion on industrial policy 1991. We had talked about what necessitated industrial policy 1991 and we also talked about LPG, which is basically the acronym by which the 1991 industrial policy is known. Today we are going to discuss the industrial policy 1991's provision regarding the public sector. Now, the industrial policy of 1991 limited the role of public sector. I told you earlier also that this was the end of license Raj, permit Raj, and basically it was because of 1991 policy that India started moving from leftist kind of economic system towards more rightist kind of economic system, from being a predominantly socialist kind of economic system which was governed by dictums from the central authority to a more open kind of economic system which was governed by market forces. So the public sector role was limited to strategically important goods, for example only to defense equipments, or to essential infrastructure goods and services. For example, oil is a very important vital good for the economy because it is the crude oil on which the machinery runs, and this was the case in 1991. At that point of time we didn't have green energy sources like solar energy, so predominantly crude oil and its refinery products and coal. These were the sources of energy at that point of time, and they were very, very important for the infrastructure of the country because all transportation was dependent on crude oil products like petrol and diesel, and likewise machinery being used in industries was also using crude oil and its products. So this was very, very essential for the economy at that point of time. So the public sector role was restricted to such sectors only: exploration and harnessing of oil. We are basically talking about exploration of crude oil. So you have to explore crude oil because crude oil reserves are generally found below the earth. So you have to explore where they could be found. So this exploration was restricted to public sector enterprises. No private sector was allowed in such sectors. Likewise, exploration of important mineral resources, important metals, that was also restricted to public sector, and no private sector was allowed. And there were other areas which were important for the development of the economy of the country. For example, railway transportation, which was a major mode of transportation for people here in India. So there also private sector was not allowed and it was restricted to public sector only. It was restricted, private sector entry was restricted, and it was only to be managed by the public sector enterprises. Areas with inadequate private sector investment. So there were some areas, and we have read about such areas where the gestation period is very high. I hope you recall our discussion in unit number 3, wherein I talked about the public sector enterprises. So they have to invest in those areas, those sectors of the economy, those projects where the gestation period is very, very long. And naturally in such areas the private sectors generally don't find it profitable to invest in such areas, so they don't invest there. So such areas also the private sector investment was, since it was not coming, so such areas were also reserved for the public sector enterprises. Now 8 important industries were retained for public sector. No private enterprise could have come up in these sectors. For example, arms and equipments is strategically very important for the economy. Defense equipments, warships, for example INS Vikrant. These are warships. There are so many warships here, and we have got the production units which produce warships, which manufacture warships here in India. So this sector was reserved for public sector play. Atomic energy is in fact, along with railways, is still also reserved for public sector play, and no private sector enterprises are allowed as far as atomic energy generation is concerned. Atomic energy or nuclear energy generation is concerned, I hope you know that we have different nuclear power plants. For example, one is there in Kalpakkam in Tamil Nadu, Narora, Rawat Bhata. These are the various nuclear plants that we have, sites where we have nuclear plants. So they are run by public sector enterprises still. Likewise, railway operations are still the sole preserve of the public sector enterprises. mining of atomic minerals, as I said, and mining of copper, lead, zinc, iron ore, coal and lignite. I told you that coal along with crude oil was among the major source of energy at that point of time. So these were all retained for public sector enterprises, which meant no private sector firm could have entered this sector. No private sector firm could have set up an atomic energy generation unit, or no private sector could have at that point of time produced arms and ammunition. So these sectors, 6 examples I have given. There were 8 such sectors, all of them were reserved for public sector. And in selected PSUs, there was disinvestment of 5 to 20% of the stake. I hope you recall our last discussion on the difference between privatization and disinvestment. So 5 to 20% of the government stake, only a minority stake was sold to selected PSUs. The idea was this was basically done to raise resources, because at that point of time you know that the government was facing fiscal deficit also, revenue deficit also. So the idea was to raise resources by selling these minority stakes in the selected PSUs who were working fine, those who were working well, because otherwise if the PSUs were not working well, then the private sector would not have displayed any interest in buying them. So these PSUs, 5 to 20% of the stake, minority stake, was sold to private sector enterprises. The idea was to raise resources, because by selling, the government actually wanted to increase its earning, which could then be used for adding to the already existing infrastructure. Then another reason was to instill market discipline. What do we mean by market discipline? Now, please understand, supposing you disinvest 5 to 20% of your stake and you sell the stake in the open market, in the stock market. Now what will happen? Now the prices of your stock, because with 5 to 20% of your ownership, 5 to 20% of your stock has been sold in the stock market and is owned by retail investors. Now if you do not perform well, what would these retail investors do? They would sell off your shares. And when they sell off your shares, what would happen? Your prices, the prices of your shares would reduce. So this ultimately brought market discipline to these PSUs. Those PSUs who had sold minority shares in the stock market, because now it was their obligation to perform well, because if only they perform well, the investors would continue to invest in their shares and the share prices would continue to rise. If they do not perform well, the share price would go down. So this actually instilled market discipline among these PSUs, and some of the PSUs benefited from this policy. Then there were loss-making PSUs. So some of them were referred to the Board of Industrial and Financial Reconstruction. So this board is basically meant to provide assistance so that the loss-making PSUs can be turned around, so that they could be turned around and they could be made profit-making. And if the PSUs could still not improve, then it was decided that they would be privatized, they would be sold off to private players. The majority ownership in them would be sold off to private players. Then for those PSUs, those public sector enterprises who were performing well, they were given more autonomy. So the government said, okay, since you are performing well, you need to decide your affairs on your own. We are not going to intervene much. So this particular autonomy was given to those who were making profit. And those PSUs which were operating in high priority areas. So some of the PSUs were operating in priority areas which were very, very vital for the growth of the Indian economy, for the overall well-being of the Indian economy. So such PSUs were given more management autonomy. They were allowed to take decisions with higher financial implications, and the government intervention was slowly reduced, and they were allowed to function according to what their management felt. So this is what we know as management autonomy, and management autonomy was granted to those public sector enterprises which were performing well. Then what about licensing? Let's talk about licensing. Licensing regime was now limited to 18 sectors. Now, I told you in the last session, there was the earlier period before 1991, which was known as Permit Raj, License Raj, Inspector Raj. Now this regime was done away with, and now you need it as a new entrepreneur, as an industrialist. If you want to set up an industrial unit, you didn't need license. You needed license only if you were setting up units in 18 sectors. All other sectors, if you want to set up a unit, you don't need to have a license, you don't need to have a permit from the government. You can straight away start. Only for these 18 sectors, which were again very strategically very important for the economy, or they were important from the perspective of the environment, or they were producing those luxury items which had high import content, which meant that they were importing a lot of items from foreign countries and using those imports to produce luxury items. So such sectors were still in a way restricted for private sector entry. The private sector could have entered these sectors, but before that they had to apply for license. So no private sector enterprise could have functioned without a license in these 18 sectors, right? And now why was this done? I hope you can understand. This was done to preserve the forex reserve, because if you are producing luxury items which very high imported content, what will happen? You will have to import a lot of items from foreign countries, which will ultimately reduce your forex reserve, which because you'll have to pay for that item in foreign currency. So the forex reserve will have to be reduced. Is that fine? So these kind of sectors, such sectors which were either strategically vital, which were very important from the environment perspective, or which had a lot of import content, they were still regulated in a sense that if the private sector enterprises wanted to come up in these sectors, they had to have the licenses from the government. Now have a look at these kind of sectors. Coal and lignite, strategically very important. Fine. Then let's talk about petroleum distillation, strategically important. Alcoholic drinks, cigars, tobacco, cigarettes manufactured. Now why there was licensing requirement? Because such products are not good for public health. So there was a concern for public health also. Now have a look at entertainment, electronic items. Then have a look at these motor cars, white goods. They had a lot of import component. These were basically luxury items. They are not necessity items. They are luxury items, and they have a lot of import content. And that is why licensing was required to set up unit in these sectors. Again, have a look at asbestos. Now, it is something that may lead to environment pollution, for example, paper, right? So again, there was licensing requirement which was retained for these kind of sectors. So you can have a look at these sectors, and you can note them down also. Please note that I have used a slightly different color to denote these three sectors: motor cars, raw hides and skins, khal, जानवर की खाल, as well as leather, white goods, because they were then delicensed later. The licensing requirement in these three sectors was then done away with later on, in a few years after 1991. So then we were only left with 15 sectors where if private sector enterprises are coming up, they had to obtain licenses from the government. So in the coming session that we'll discuss the trade liberalization, which happened because of industrial policy 1991. You can say that we'll basically be discussing the globalization aspect of the LPG 1991. And today you have understood that we talked about two sectors, two aspects basically. One was privatization, in the sense that the loss-making PSUs were sold, and there was a little bit of disinvestment in selected PSUs. So in that sense, we have discussed privatization, and we have also discussed liberalization, because the licensing requirements were done away with, except for in these 18 sectors. So in these 18 sectors, the licensing requirement was still retained. And as I told you, after some time, there were only 15 sectors left in which there were licensing requirements which were retained. Fine. So thank you very much for your time today.